everyone, I'm Chris Saxon. I'm part of Stephen Feuerstein's Oracle Developer Advocate team. It's my job to help you get the best out of Oracle Database and hopefully have some fun whilst doing so. So with that in mind, it's great to be here today on today's SQL Office Hours session. Reminder, this is your chance to ask us any questions you've got about SQL or Oracle Database. If you've got anything you want to say, just put it in the chat. If you would actually like to talk, you've got a microphone, then just let us know. We can unmute you and we can have a chat directly. That's always useful if you've got a complex issue that you want to work through. We are going to be talking on a topic that's something that comes up fairly frequently when it comes to working with databases generally, and that's loading and unloading data into and out of them. Specifically, we're going to be looking at using external tables to do this. So these are a fantastic feature which allow you to read CSV and other types of files into your database using the power of SQL. So let's get started. All right then. So to create an external table, it's pretty straightforward. You just have the definition of your table, add the organization external keywords, and then literally the minimum you need is a default directory, that is which folder on the database server the files will live, and the name of the file you're actually going to read. Do that, and the database assumes that you're reading a straightforward CSV. If you want to read something a bit more complicated, let's say you want to read a JSON document, or you've got fields with colon separators or fixed width and all sorts. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the access and fields parameters which allow you to actually manipulate them. So there's a lot of detail in there. So there's a lot of detail in them. I wasn't going to go through those specifically, but if you do have questions, then let me know. Alrighty then. So as I say, external tables, great way to use the power of SQL to read these files into your database. And one of the great things is quite often you use external tables to read files into your database when you do data warehouse loads. So quite often you get files from all sorts of places. People export them. You've got to load them into your database to merge with your other data. And if you're not using external tables, quite often what that means you need to do is first load the file into a table and then read it back out again. So by having it an external table, you can just read it straight from the file, saving yourself a bit of effort. And also you can just join straight from that external table to other tables in your database. So if we've got a CSV file like this, we can just query it like so. And as I say, you've got the full power of SQL. You can join it with regular tables. You can do aggregations on it, and so on and so forth to manipulate the data however you need. However, when you're using these, particularly for data warehouse loads, quite often the file names are stamped with the date that they were created, which makes things a little bit tricky to do, makes the load process a little bit awkward. You can actually point one external table to many different files, but that's not always practical or appropriate when you're doing load process. It's usually safer and easier if you can assume you're just reading one file at a time, which makes things complicated if they've got these different names. Either you've got to go through a process first of take that file, strip the date off it, convert it to sales.csv or some other standard name, do the load, and then rename it afterwards to archive it off, which is a bit of a faff. Or you've got to go and do some DDL. You've got to run a whole bunch of altered tables, changing which file your external table is reading from. Either way, this is a bit of a pain and a bit of a faff, particularly if you find that like last week's file failed for some reason and you need to rerun the load process, and it gets really fiddly and tricky to actually sort this all out. So it'd be better if you could just kind of temporarily, just for your query, point that table to look at a new file just for that individual query. So in 12.2, we introduced the external table parameter override feature. So this external modify clause that we have. And using this, you can change the settings for the various file-based parameters. So the actual file you're reading from, the log files, bad files, and also the reject limit. So instead of having to run some DDL against your table to change it, we can just use this external modify clause and say we're looking at different files. So we can see we can read from the first there, want to read from the second, we just change the name of the file in the location. So this is pretty powerful, really useful, and it's something I really wish had existed about 5 or 10 years ago when I was doing a lot of data warehouse importing. But there we go, we've got it now. So you've got the ability to just temporarily point the external table at a different file. Very handy when you're loading files with different file names. But what happens if it's not just the file name that's changing? What if it's actually the structure of the file that changes as well? Maybe something like month end and year end, you get slightly different files with different summary information, or maybe the files just got corrupted for some reason, right? Remember, these are CSV files, they're just text. Anyone can open them up and do whatever they want. I have known it for people to kind of intercept these files partway through the process. You know, they open them up in Excel or whatever just to do some validation or check the data. And then when they save it back down, they save it with different settings, maybe adding or removing the field enclosure. So adding or removing quotes from around fields, changing the separator. Maybe it was a semicolon and they've changed it comma, that kind of thing, which means that your external table just doesn't work anymore because it's got different definition essentially. It doesn't match the access and field parameters you've set. And this is a bit more fiddly, a bit more tricky to deal with because you've got a one-off file which is basically slightly corrupted. It doesn't quite fit your exact definition because someone's just fiddled with it slightly. And you just want to be able to read it in and load it in. Now, with the external modify clause, we could change which file we're reading, but that's it. So in 18C, we added inline external tables. So these are external tables which literally only exist in your query. So to do that, we just use this little external keyword. You list out the columns that you want to read from the file, and then you just literally paste in the definition of your external table. So this is pretty handy. This is a way you can then just on the fly change which file you're reading. And so, as I said, if you've got a file which has failed for some reason, it's slightly corrupted, someone's changed with all the terminators and so on, you could just temporarily run a query to load it in and stage it, do whatever it is that you need to. Also potentially very useful if you do a lot of ad hoc reporting. You know, maybe this isn't part of a standard data warehouse loading, but you just get lots of log files in. For example, your standard application writes all its logging information to various files, and every now and again, you want to query them through the database. But you don't want to create an external table for each one because they've got different formats. You only do this ad hoc. We can use this external clause to just read them on the fly. Also potentially useful if we want to do things like if you're working in read-only environments. So sometimes you may be in situations where you have not got permissions to create tables. You've got that directory object, which tells you where that file lives, but either your user isn't able to create tables, the DBA doesn't allow you to do it, maybe you're an active data guard or something like that. So the database itself is read-only, but there's various files that you actually want to access. So external clause allows you to read these on the fly. However, there's another interesting use for these, and which allows you to kind of transport data between databases. So that kind of brings me to the next part of the equation. We've talked so far about reading data into your database using external tables. And I think a lot of people are at least familiar with the concept of these, even if they haven't actually used them that closely. However, what a lot of people, so a question from Dennis, and we can manipulate this kind of queries inline external table using dynamic SQL inside PL SQL. So if you're saying you want to change the change which files, if you've got some PL SQL and you want to change the columns, for example, or the access parameters, then you're using dynamic SQLs. Yes, yes, yeah, that's right, Dennis. I mean, in theory, you could have a static on-the-fly external table in your PL SQL. Probably that's a misuse of the feature, because if you know exactly what it is that you're going to be querying, you should probably just create a real external table, right? So these are perhaps more useful for situations where you don't know the definition of the file, like say ad hoc reporting, or also potentially very useful when you're trying to figure out the definition for the file. So if the file you're reading isn't a straightforward CSV, it can be really tricky to figure out how to get those access and field parameters correct so it loads everything appropriately. By using the inline external table, you can hash out, just fiddle with your query to figure out the definition, get that right, without having to drop and recreate the table, which is something you have to do if you create an external table. If you've got a classic external table, you create it, you realize you got the parameters wrong, and you go, okay, now we've got to drop the table again, tweak them, fiddle them. When it's all just in the fly on a query, you can just run your query. Okay, that didn't work. We'll just change the query slightly without having to drop and recreate the table. So it can be potentially very useful when it comes to figuring out the real definition for your external table. But yes, you're right, Dennis. If you want to do this, if you want to manipulate the parameters there, you dynamic SQL and PL SQL. Okay. So UDIS, the biggest problem is that the file should reside on the database server or a network location mapped to it, and the DBAs do not always like to manage such things. Very good point, UDIS. Yes, the files do need to be accessible from the database server. So that means either transferred onto the file at the server itself, or as you say, some kind of network mounted file. Yeah, sadly, DBAs are not always happy about such things. It's, in some ways, you've got to kind of figure out how you want to phrase the argument. It depends on what you're trying to do. But if you're actually having to load these files into the database, I think this is the best way. It's up to them to propose an alternative. But obviously, this is kind of internal politics and dealing with people. So yeah, challenges there. Okay, so Dennis, you mean that if I want to have a file name as a parameter of my PL SQL function, then it's better to use external modify clause inside my PL SQL routine? Yes, that's right. If you just want to change the file name, that's fine. Yeah, you can do that. So you can dynamically on the fly change which file you're actually reading from. If it's changing the structure of the or changing the type of file you're reading, then yeah, you wouldn't do that quite so straightforwardly. So Niels, I had a project where we stored the files to be read and their field definitions in the database and created the external tables, the tables in the database, and loaded the data through execute immediate. So now we would only need a CTAS statement, the external clause. Okay, so if you've got the definition, yeah, so Niels, you don't need the CTAS, the create table as select at all now. So with these inline external tables, you just say select from external, and like I say, if you've got that definition in a database table, then you construct some dynamic SQL that reads it and load it. So you don't need to create the table at all now. So you could just use that in that scenario that you've described. Okay, so from AR and random numbers, how does data inserted in table from a large file, is it for all insertions or single rows by rows? So in terms of how is the file read from the database, do you mean? I mean, in terms of how you insert the data for all or row by row or whatever, that's really how you write your code. You can just do, if you've got an external table, you can say, insert into real table, select star from external table. And that's just straightforward, normal SQL statement. Or you could do bulk processing, or you could loop through it and do single row inserts. Probably not the best idea. In terms of how it reads the file itself, though, that's a bit too low level for me. I don't know the exact details. Okay. All right, question from Alan. Can we create primary key or index on external tables? So good question, Alan. No, you cannot create indexes on external tables. And the reason for this is because the file itself is outside the control of the database. So someone can come along and edit the file, so open it up in their text editor or Excel or something, change some data, and save the file. At that point, the database has no idea that the file has changed, okay? So that means if any structures we had, like on indexes, would now be would have invalid references. And there is no easy or obvious way to sync these up, because the whole point here is you're reading files which are outside the control of the database, so you cannot create indexes on them. So it's a good question, and it raises an important point, which we're going to come back to a little later on in this session. Okay. So do we have control on SQL cursors? So like status, how many rows processed in the case of errors, save point or rollback? Yeah. So the point for external tables is you are using them like a regular table. So you can't insert into them. You can't do DML like insert, update, delete. But when it comes to queries, you are accessing them just like a normal table. So anything you can do with normal SQL, you've got with external tables as well when it comes to queries. So all those kind of points, yeah, you've got all that information. User says, primary keys, yes, but in roll I disable state. Thanks, Dev Jim. Yes. Okay, any other questions on these before I move on? There's lots of good questions. Thanks, people. No? Okay. All right, then. So what we've looked at so far is using external tables to read files into the database. And we've done this with the Oracle Loader driver. So there's two drivers available for external tables. Oracle Loader, which is kind of similar to the SQL Loader option. And there is also a data pump driver, which is similar to data pump import and export. So we can do that, create a table with Oracle Data Pump. Now, this brings us to the interesting and little-known option. You can actually use this data pump driver to unload data from your database. So we can do a create table as select using this data pump driver, and it will spit the contents, it will dump the contents of this query, the result of that, into whichever file name you've specified. So you can use external tables to unload data, but only if they've got the data pump driver and if and in create table as select. You still can't do insert, update, delete on these. You can only do like a one-off unload the result of this query. So this is pretty neat, and it allows us to do some pretty cool things when it comes to unloading data. However, one thing to note, I said it's a data pump unload. However, the files it creates are not compatible with traditional export import data pump export import. So at this point, you might be thinking, oh, this is great. You know, we can just do a create table as select, do a data pump export, and then use imp dp to load it. No. Similarly, if you've used export dp, xdp, to create a whole bunch of dump files for various reasons, you can't then read them using external tables, which is a shame. Maybe one day we'll get there. I don't think I'm not sure, aware of plans to resolve this, but it's worth being aware of this. So Neil says, good feature. Use the export in Oracle Data Pump to transfer the data of specific tables between databases at different locations where it was not possible to create database links between them. It's a great point, Niels, and that's kind of one of the use cases I think this is great for. So quite often you need to export data from a database and import it to other places. So you need to unload some data from production, for example, and load it into a test database so you can figure out why you encountered a bug, or you just need to refresh your lookup data and that kind of thing. So this is a great way to be able to transfer data between databases. So you're just saying we use this during some application upgrades. Okay, interesting. Was that just a way of kind of backing up your tables in case something went hideously wrong, or was there something else, some other reason for doing that, Judith? I'll let you type away and let us know what's going on there. Okay, so let's just have a little kind of example of this. So we can create our table with our data pump driver, select star from a query, and then, as I said, it will create the file for you on the database server. And then you can read it back in just using a query. And as Niels was saying, if we can just transfer this file around the network, or even if it's on a shared drive, a shared location, as long as all the databases that want to read that file have that location mounted, you could actually just unload it to that and everyone can read from it. So you don't actually need to transfer data around at all, which could be very useful in some scenarios. So this is, as we say, a neat way to transfer data around. Okay, so Dennis, so what format does this data pump has then? Will it pump the SEN value if I import such file into another database? Okay, so it uses, it's kind of data pump-like, but it's not exactly same as data pump itself. And the question about pumping the SCN isn't really relevant, because the only way to now read these files is via another external table using the data pump driver. You can't use data pump import to load it in. So stuff about SCN and stuff is kind of not really relevant. You've just got the snapshot of whatever that query returned at that time loaded into a file, and then you can query it back out again. To load it back in, you would then do select star from that table, insert into real table, select star from external table. So again, this is going beyond the exact details of what I know, but it uses data pump driver behind the scenes, but it's not exactly the same way as data pump export import work. So one of the things when I first learned about this is typically quite often you have loads of data pump exports lying around for all sorts of various reasons, backing up before an upgrade, as you just said, or maybe you're transferring data between systems. And after a while, you're kind of like, what the heck is in all these files? And it's like, this would be a really cool way to read those data pump exports that we've got. Unfortunately, you can't do that. They're only compatible with a external table data pump export. So be aware of that. So this allows us to transport data around, but there's another interesting use here, and that is it can form the basis of some kind of archival strategy. So quite often, we've got databases that fill up with data, and we end up with a big backlog of historic information. And people almost never query it, but either for regulatory reasons, if you're in finance, you need to keep 7 years worth of history or something like that, or just for your own internal records or whatever. You want to keep a history of that data. You want to keep it available so people can access it should they need to. But you don't want it to be part of the main table either, because that means more stuff to back up in your database, just makes query optimization and things like that harder, and so on. So you'd kind of like to move it out of the database, move it somewhere else, but still make it available to the database, so somewhere you can read it. So this kind of data pump export with as an external table is a way to implement a kind of archival strategy like this. So before I go on, see a comment from Judith. I remember once we tried to use DBMS file transfer to move files from one database to another, but for some reason it did not work. Okay, it's interesting. It's not one I've used myself, file transfer. If anyone's got any other insights or knowledge of that, let us know. But that's not one I'm too familiar with myself. Okay, so we're creating these data pumps. So what do I mean we can use this as part of an archival strategy? Well, we can do a create table select to generate the files, and then we can read them back in with external tables. Now, you could do this in one table. As I said, one external table can actually point to multiple files. But I mean, that has pros and cons. The biggest con is that when you query it, potentially you're loading all those files at the same time, which, if you've got a huge amount of historic data, probably not what you want to do, right? You only want to read the file or that actually contains the data you're reading. So in 12.2, we added the ability to partition external tables. So we see we've got an external table here with different partitions, and each of them are reading files from reading a different file. And the key advantage this offers over one normal external table with lots of files in it is we can now actually use partition elimination. We know what the upper bounds for these file partitions are, and if you supply the partition key for your query, which if you're using partitioning, something you should be doing, but provided you're doing that, then we can be sure we only read the file that you're actually interested in rather than all the files that this references. So this allows us to build a kind of archival strategy where we're moving the information to files per day, month, whatever it is, whatever period it is you want to archive by. Okay, so see comments. Niels, when I remember it correctly, the DBMS file transfer can only process Oracle files, data files, redo logs, and no normal DB-RAID files. Okay, thanks for sharing that, Niels. So Dennis, is external table partitioning available for standard edition? So no, partitioning itself is an extra cost option. And as a rule, extra cost options are only available in Enterprise Edition. So the answer there, sadly, Dennis, is no. You'll need to be on Enterprise Edition and have the partitioning option as well. Okay. Any other quick questions or comments on this? Okay. I'm dribbling water all over myself. Okay, we'll use XE then. Yep, you can use XE or 18C XE because it's all included in there. Yes, absolutely can. All right then, so let's kind of walk through how this process might work. So let's say we've got our normal table and it's partitioned up. So we've got our sales table and we've got 4 different
Chris?
Yeah.
Yes, Niels, just a question.
Yeah.
The partitioning, can you only specify different files or can you also specify different access parameters?
So for the partitioned external tables, you can specify different directory, you can specify different location, and I think that's about it. You can't change, the definition of the external table itself, unfortunately.
So you can't specify the same file for different partitions, but use different parts of the records?
Ooh, I don't think so. I'm fairly sure you can only actually change the location and the directory. I'm going to do a bit of a demo later, and we can try some things out there if you want. But I'm pretty sure it's just the directory and the location, unless someone else knows better. Okay? Is that anything else you want to say right now, Niels? Or?
Yes, thanks. No, not at the moment.
Okay, cool. Oh. All right then. Okay, so we've got our sales table here, and it's got 4 partitions, and we want to start archiving it off. So let's say we're working kind of left to right. The stuff on the left here is the oldest partition. So what we can do is use create table as select to do our data pump driver external table unload. So we've unloaded it to a file outside of the database. We can then drop that partition off, and then we can read it through our external table, our sales external table. We can then do a similar process for the next oldest partition when the time comes. Create table as select, unloads the data from that, drop the partition off, and then kind of add that as a partition to the new external table, and so on. So we can just kind of gradually migrate the data over here. So this sales external table is just reading these files, and sales reading the regular table. And of course, if you want some kind of unified view of this, we can create a view over the top of them, which unions them all together. So we can pull all the information together should we wish to do so. So this is kind of nice, but it does require that we create two separate tables and create this view to get, or some query to join it all together, or combine it all together. 19C offers another approach for this, hybrid partitioned tables. So these are partitioned tables where some of the partitions can be external, so point to files on the file server, and some of them can be regular table partitions. So, and we do that with this external partition attributes clause. So we've got external partition attributes. If it's pointing to a file on the file server, we use external location and name of the file. If it doesn't have external location, then it's kind of implicitly an internal partition. So that's just a regular partition we can read and write, load data into as normal. External location is read only, so we can query it, but we can't change it, which kind of follows the rules we've said so far about external tables. You can query them, but you can't change them after the fact. The only way to unload is create table as select. So before we had our sales table with our 4 partitions. So now we can do a similar thing. We can do a create table as select, but now we can drop off the internal partition and get it to reference that file. So it's now pointing down to the file, and do the same thing here. Create the table again, drop off the partition, and then make the partition now point to the file itself. So we're actually reading external files and internal files in one location. So this is hybrid partition tables. It's also worth noting, not only can you use this to read just like normal CSV files and so on, you can also use it to read stuff from Hive and HDFS file systems as well. So if you've got data in Hadoop or whatever that you want to read into your database, then you can do it with these external partition or hybrid partition tables. So, and as I said, this is a way you can then start archiving off your data. So one of the big problems with archiving is you kind of go, well, we've taken it out of the database, but we might still want to query it. You know, it still needs to be available and accessible should it turns out we need to actually find that information. It might be rare we need to do it, but you don't want to be restoring data from a backup or having to go through some other application, that kind of thing, to get this older information. So we can slowly, as the data gets older and older, move it out of the database to slower storage, and then eventually, when we decided we definitely don't need it anymore, actually just delete the file completely and it's gone. So it offers a way to kind of more gradually archive things off, whereas quite often at the moment, well, in my experience, people, when they're challenged with this archival problem, just kind of go, la la la, fingers in ears, doesn't really exist, we'll sort it out later. Or maybe they kind of go, well, we'll just delete the data from the primary, the transactional system, which would be behind your main application, and then load the data into a data warehouse so other people can query it. And that can create some problems if, customers want to be able to see the data. Well, then they've got to kind of come through some kind of support team internally where you route the request to them and send the data back. It's all a bit tricky and a bit of a faff. So hybrid partition tables allow you another way to approach this. Any other questions or comments on these at the moment? No, okay. Okay, so hopefully some of you are thinking, oh, that sounds pretty cool. It's a way to, expand or make more space available to the database. I know some people have seen XE and thought, well, XE has a 12 gig data limit. This is a way we can actually make have much more storage available to the database than we would normally. Be aware there are some restrictions or several restrictions for hybrid partitioned tables. And these are pretty important or pretty key. So the first one I'm going to mention relates to indexes. So we had a question earlier about, can you create an index on an external table? The answer is no, because as I said, that file's outside the control of the database. Similar thing applies with hybrid partition tables. Those external partitions, those files, are outside the control of the database. So we can't index them. So does that mean we can't index the table at all? Well, no. Some of you may know in 12c we added partial indexes. So if you've got a partition table, you can say we only want to include rows from these partitions in the index. The rest of them won't be indexed at all. So we're able to use that feature in hybrid partition tables. Only the real internal partitions can we actually create indexes on, or can we index the data of. Any data which is in those data pump files or CSVs or however you decided to export them, you cannot index those. So we can have partial indexes on these hybrid partition tables. Okay, that's good. We can still get some indexing benefits, but this probably leads to the biggest drawback here. So we cannot have unique indexes on hybrid partition tables. Why? Well, you cannot have partially indexed unique indexes, which, when you think it through, kind of makes sense. A unique index says these values can only occur once in the table. If some of those partitions are not part of the index, well, how do we validate that we don't have duplicates in there? Well, the short answer is we can't, or at least not under the current architecture that Oracle Database uses. So we can't have unique indexes. So a related thing this brings about is that any constraints you create on this table must be rely disable. Okay, so this is something which for some of you may make this feature a bit of a non-starter. Basically, constraints are pretty much off the table, and for the most part are not going to work. So you can't use them to enforce data quality. So Judith, that is external partitions automatically have indexing off. That's right, Judith. So any external partitions in a hybrid partition table have indexing off, and there's nothing you can do about that. You could still change the setting for the internal partitions, set those on or off as you decide to, but the ones which are external, you have to be indexing off. So big thing to be aware of. You can't have enabled constraints on these. So this will restrict or limit where you're able to use these. Next thing is, in terms of the partitioning types, we only support list and range partitioning, so no hash partitions, which, again, if you think it through, kind of makes sense. With hash partitioning, we take the partition key and then it could be hash it to a value. So it could be in any partition. We don't necessarily know in advance exactly where it's going to go. And if we were hashing, in theory, you could end up hashing a value that's in an external table or in a file, an external file and an internal file to the same partition. So it doesn't make sense. So no hash partitioning. But also when I say list and range partitioning only, that also means you can't have the manageability extensions for these. Automatic and interval partitioning are not currently available for hybrid partition tables. So be aware of that, which, again, particularly for range partition tables, interval partitioning just makes things so much easier. There's no chance of forgetting to create the new partition or split values out of a max value partition. You've got to go with the traditional max value range partitioning if you want to use hybrid partition tables. So there are some limitations with these. Okay. I'm going to jump over to a demo. Any Are there questions or comments at this point while I start bringing the demo up? Does external tables support the use of direct NFS? Good question, and I'm not sure. Off the top of my head, I mean, if you, I'd have to check exactly, but I'm not sure if anyone on the call knows. But yeah, I'd have to check. Okie dokie. So like I say, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'll go through and do a little demo. So got a little table here, and I'll just stick some data in it. So it's fairly small, just got 50 rows, just keep things nice and simple. And the first thing is, well, we just got a regular heap table here, and someone goes, we want to start archiving this data. So one of the things we want to do is partition it so we can make it easier to manage this and drop off the old partitions. So 12.2, we added the ability to partition a table with an alt table. So this is a relatively recent addition. We can run this statement, and then there we go. We partition our table by these values. Very easy, and judging by the number of questions we get about this, this is obviously going to be quite a popular feature as people actually migrate to 12.2, because people are constantly asking, how do I partition an existing table? Okay, question from Dennis. What are the advantages of using hybrid partitioning to having a view which combines a local table with a number of external ones? Local tables, all indexes, and so that's a good question, Dennis, and it's one of those where there's various pros and cons. So thing is, you're not going to be able to have constraints on your partitioned external table. So from that aspect of it, it's in terms of constraints and indexing on that external data, it's kind of a wash. And it kind of depends on how you want to actually manage this. So with a hybrid partition table, it's a single table, and your application can refer to it. You don't need to change any code to make it, to be able to use it. But as we said, there's various restrictions on there, which may mean your main sales table, you probably wouldn't want to use this. Not being able to have a primary key, not being able to have enabled foreign keys, and so on. Yeah. So it's kind of up to you at the moment in terms of what your use case is. So I think a scenario where hybrid partition tables probably would be quite useful is things like logging and audit data. So this is information where typically you only query it if there's a problem. So, customers raised some issue, there's a bug, or you've got some kind of audit going on, and then you need to access it and see what's there. So it's not part of your normal application functioning. So if queries take a few minutes to run, it sort of doesn't matter. And here, and again, you probably wouldn't have any or many constraints on them because it's just logging and audit data. You're not going to be having any foreign keys between them and so on. So here, the limitations around indexing and constraints are less of an issue. But for your main transactional tables, the one your application's writing to, I'd be more tempted to go with the partitioned external table and the view with the union all, because then on the internal partitions, you still get the full benefit of being able to index and constrain them as appropriately. And so you need to think about your use case and what you're doing them for, really. Okay, question for you is, what about updates? Will they work if all the target rows are located in the internal partitions? Yes, so you mean, other DML against internal partitions. So yes, you can access the internal partitions as normal, as you would normally. So that's not an issue there. Oh yeah, one other point, Dennis. So when you've got a hybrid partition table, provided you've got your partition key in your query, it can use partition elimination to decide which one to access. If you've got a view with a union all on it, then depending on how exactly you set your tables up, the database doesn't necessarily know or isn't necessarily able to do partition elimination to figure out that it can ignore either the internal or the external partitions. So with the union all, you could end up with situations where you end up reading the whole of the external file plus the internal partitions, depending on the types of your query. I mean, still a problem with hybrid. If you've not got the partition key, it's just more likely with the union all that you'll unnecessarily read the files or the internal data when you don't need to. So I hope that helps, Dennis. Okay, so where were we? So we partitioned our table, and now we're going to start doing our archival. So I'm going to create a temporary table that's just going to dump this, and I'm going to use the partition syntax. So I'm just dumping the contents of that partition into this file, and we'll create that table like so. And just to show you the inline external table, so got my external keyword here. So we can now query that data pump file, just like so. And as I'm saying here, the columns must match what are in the file, but you don't actually need to specify all the columns. So if I run this query again now, with 3 columns in it, we get the 3 columns back. So it doesn't need to be an exact match of all the columns, but the columns you specify do need to exist. But we're just generating this on the fly. It's not a real external table, whereas this is the external table itself, and we've got all the data there. Okay, so now we want to make this part of our hybrid partition table, get this file into that table. So we need to drop off the internal partition, and this is a one-off setup operation to actually say it's a hybrid partition table, say where it's reading the data from, essentially, enable that. And we can see now it is partitioned and it is a hybrid. And then we can split that first partition out. So it comes from the external table and the real partition. So now values from partition P0, less than 10, come from the file. The other ones are the real table. How do we know this? How do we know this for sure? Well, we can look at the execution plan. So I'll look at for value 1, and let's make this a bit bigger so you can see what's actually going on here. You can see we specified the partition key. We know it's accessing just one partition, or the database knows based on the high-low values, and we're doing an external table access. And you can see it's doing partition start and stop. So it's doing partition elimination there. If we look for value 20, we can see table access, so it's regular, internal table data. And again, we got partition elimination. And if we do all the values less than 20, so this will read both our internal and external table, you can see, looks a bit weird here. We've got hybrid part full read and full read. So we can see that we're reading different internal and external partitions. So we can play around with those. And just on your question there, Judith, so we do update T set C3 equals 100, where C1 equals 30. Let's pick a. You can see we can update that. If we make it 3, which is the file, we're going to get an error because external tables, the external partitions are read-only, so we can't change those. So we can change the internal partitions as you would regular SQL. We cannot change the external partitions. Okay. So looking at constraints, I mentioned constraints. If we want to do those, we have to create them rely disabled. So let's create a table from this, and we're going to create a foreign key from our hybrid partition to this new real table. We try and do it without the rely disabled. Error, can't do it. We need to specify those. And you might go, well, what's the point in creating foreign keys like this that we can't use? Well, a couple of things. First up, it helps document your database. People can then see the relationships which do exist. If they're generating schema diagrams from your database using Oracle Data Modeler or something like that, they can see which relationships are actually there. And it's not just that coincidentally the columns have the same name, but also the optimizations for foreign keys, things like table elimination, can still apply, provided we fiddle with this query rewrite integrity parameter. So you can see here we're accessing both the tables, but if we get the execution plan, T2 is not in the plan anywhere, because it knows, okay, we've got foreign key from here to there. It's rely disabled, but we said, trust us, trust us that we're safe and we haven't messed with our data in any silly way. So it can say, okay, I don't need to access this table at all. I can remove it from the query completely. So we've still got optimizations provided we play with that. Okay, any other questions or comments on these hybrid partition tables, external tables generally? Anything else you want to ask? No? Okay. All right then. I'm keeping an eye on chat if you've got some questions. Few little things I want to show you to wrap up. You can convert a hybrid partition table just back to a regular partition one. First of all, you've got to get rid of all the external partitions. So we'll drop that off, and then we can remove the external partition attributes. So it's now just a regular partition table. And if we go back up here, it should say no. There we go. So it's no longer hybrid partitioned. So you can convert one way and the other. So if you added it, found out this isn't really doing what we wanted to do, you can convert back. One other thing I wanted to mention on data pump unload. So far, we've really just been using it to export a single table. You can also use data pump unload to export any query at all, really. So here we're doing the classic HR employees and departments join. So we're getting those, and we're going to unload that into data pump file. So now we've exported the results of that query. And as I say, we can then copy that or mount the share somewhere else, use our inline external table, and just read from it. So we can now see, got the employee details, bar chart to 100. And there we go. We can pull that information. So you don't need to use this just, the data pump unload and query. It's not just necessarily for transferring a specific table. You can use it to export a query as well, which again can be quite useful in some scenarios. If you want to load information into test databases, or you want to recreate problems, you've got some sample data that you need to transfer to someone else. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Okay, then we are coming up to now, about 5 minutes left. That covers pretty much what I was gonna, what I had to say. Any other comments or questions on this? So Dennis, I believe you already mentioned this, but to be sure, is it possible to unload a hybrid partition table using another organization external type data pump as select? So is it possible to create the partition, you mean? So, well, let's approach this. To create the file, you have to do a create table as select. There is no create a partition to make the file, okay? So that's the first thing. You can, if we've got data in an hybrid partition table, you can query them like they're with regular SQL, and then you could unload that into another file, should you wish to do so. So that you can do that as well. You could export that external table partition into another external file should you wish to do so, but not quite sure why you'd want to do that, but maybe there's a reason. Does that answer your question, Dennis? No, I mean this. I have T1 hybrid partition. I need to export data from it into T2 organized external. Okay, yep. Using create table as select. Right, okay. So you want to export the internal data or the external data? So the first thing there is, if it's, yeah, so Niels, everything you can query with select can be written to an X table with a CTAS. So that's right, Niels. Any query you can write, more or less, you can then export to a data pump file with create table as select. Export mixed data into external. Yes, you could export internal and external data into. So actually, if we just do this, if I resplit, if I recreate the table or re-add the things, where's the statement? Scroll down a bit. So let's re-add the attributes and then split the partition. So it's now hybrid partitioned again, where we've got like that. I can then, if I do create table as, I'm going to take this and strip this off and give this a new file name. I'll call it all or something like that. We can then, what is going on here? What have I done? Oh, I need to change the name. So to classic way to solve problems, name clash, just add a number on the end. You can see we've exported external and internal data all into one file. And the other thing is, if you've already got a file which has all the information you need, you can have many external tables all pointing at it. You know, we've got the T0, if I go back up, this file, I have my external table, which I use to create it, that points to it, as does the hybrid partition table, that partition. So if you've got one file, many external tables could reference it. If you've want to export all your data from internal and external all into one file again, yes, you can do that like this. I hope that I've got it and you can help to understand. So a question from AR on all the numbers, will you share exercise files? I'll think about how I can share these. Sadly, LiveSQL doesn't support external tables at all. So while I could load them in there, the script would just be full of errors. So that's not necessarily the best way of doing this. But certainly I will, actually, I might be able to add them as a resource on the file, on the AskTOM page itself. I'll see, but if I find out a way, I will tweet and let you all know that these are available. Okay, question. When we create external table, will it overwrite existing files or remove old data? No. So, good question. You cannot overwrite an existing file. So, see, we've got our HR external. If I rename the file, so I'm trying to create a new table, but I leave the file name the same, then we are going to get an error because the file already exists. So it won't let you just kind of wipe out and replace. So you need to figure out what you want to do here. So this is probably a good safety mechanism to prevent you accidentally overwriting files. But there might be situations where you do want to do it, in which case you've got to do you can see at the top of my script here, I've got a whole bunch of fremove so I can reset everything before it starts. So will LiveSQL ever support using external tables? So that's a good question, Judith. There are security issues around external tables. We're looking and hoping to see if we can create, for example, some read-only files, which we can at least demo it with. but you wouldn't be able to do this unloader stuff. I don't see that ever happening, or be able to write files. So yeah, we're hoping to have a solution, but don't count on it happening anytime soon. Okay, so Niels, another feature of external tables should be mentioned, preprocessor. Yep, so that's a great thing to mention, Niels, the preprocessor. So for those of you who don't know, that allows you to run a script while you're reading the file. The classic example of this is you've got file which is zipped up or tarred up or whatever. Normally, if you wanted to read that, you would have to unzip the file and then read it. With a preprocessor, you can pass the file straight into a script which does the unzipping. So you don't need to unzip the file into its uncompressed form and then read it. You can just read the zip file directly, which can have good space savings. And there's various other reasons you might want to do, things like if you're great at your awk or sed processing, do a bit of manipulation of what's actually in the file, particularly if it's interesting data, shall we say. Okay.
Another scenario where I have used it
go on.
Is to read the content of a directory.
Yes.
To see if there are new files or if files have changed. You can call any script by the preprocessor, and the file you want to read is passed as the first parameter to the script.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good one.
So you only need an empty file, which is the location of the external table, and the script does read any directory you want. It is fixed in the script, but you can read all the contents. I use it on Windows with a dir/v /w in a wide format and see also the dates of the files and can read it in.
That's a great one. Yeah, a good one to add, because knowing what's in the folder can be very useful at times. Okay, so thanks, Niels. Anyone we're just past the hour. Got any last final comments they want to say? Hybrid partition tables, what do people think? Good, bad, not sure? Need to play with it a bit more before we decide exactly how we feel about it. So Neil says good. Any other votes on that one? Okay, but a bit over-engineered. In some ways, I'd say it's a bit under-engineered, because currently the process is a bit convoluted in that you've got to do the create table, drop the partition, rename it. This is version 1 of the feature, remember. We are planning on making this a bit more seamless. So we'll have some commands so you can kind of do it in one operation, more or less. So that whole convert an internal to an external partition can be more straightforward. Not sure exactly when those are going to arrive, but we do plan to make this a bit more straightforward, a bit easier to use. Potential for chaos. Yes, very good point. Judith, I think complete file management package should be made available, maybe extending new files, discussed in several forums. Where you've got ideas or how exactly you'd like that to work, let us know on the database ideas forum, and we'll see what we can do. Dennis, I think, yeah, okay, says true. Yeah, if you're not familiar with the database ideas forum, if you could, let's see if I can, well, yes, if you go, I'll just bring it in the chat quickly. Here we go. If you go there and give us details of how exactly you think this should work and what it should do, then maybe we'll be able to include that. Okay, last one. What's the max size we could load with external table to database? That really depends on your file system. I think one of the things with these external tables is you're reading files off your OS, and it's really down to your operating system limits, and different operating systems have different restrictions. The thing to remember is when you've got an external table, we don't really have good ways of optimizing that read. If you've got a colossal 1 terabyte file, in theory, we're going to read that whole terabyte before we return any results. Okay, so you've got CSV, which is truly massive. We don't have any good real ways of optimizing that while we're reading it. So think carefully about using this to read truly massive files. You probably want to split them into smaller files and use partitioned external tables to make the performance of this kind of manageable. All right then, if there's no further comments, 18 gigabyte generated by COBOL from Neil. Oh, God, that sounds like fun. But, all right then. Okay, so thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. But more importantly, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again soon. Okay, so cheerio.